Good morning, everybody. We're going to begin in just a few moments. Good morning, everyone. We're going to begin in a few moments. Please feel free to add your country and organization name into the chat so we can get to see where everybody's from. Good morning, everyone. We're going to begin in a few moments. We'll wait until we have a few more people joining us today. Go ahead and let us know where you're from in the chat, the country and organization that you're joining us from. My name is Susan Melnick, and I'm the Communications Specialist here at ASAP, which stands for Accelerating Support to Advance Local Partners. We are a USAID PEPFAR funded program. All right, I think we'll go ahead and get started while everybody's starting to file in. So again, my name is Susan Melnick, and I am the ASAP Communications Specialist. Our USAID PEPFAR funded program is Accelerating Support to Advance Local Partners, and we're really proud to be able to put on these webinars. This, I believe, is our 68th webinar, and we'll be sharing more information about where you can watch past webinars in a few moments. Be great, could you skip ahead one, please? Thank you. So once again, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us. Let us know where you're from in the chat. Let us know the country and organization you're joining us from. We ask that during our webinars, you use the Q&A box, which you'll see it's at the very bottom of your screen. And that's where we use to ask questions of today's presenters. And we'd really appreciate if you could go ahead and use that box. Feel free to use the chat to communicate with one another. But the box we save just for questions. So we'd appreciate that. We will have one poll during the webinar today. It'll come up about 15 minutes before the end of the webinar, and it'll just pop up on your screen. And as a reminder, we're going to go ahead and upload this webinar once it's recorded and ready tomorrow morning, along with the presentation from Molly onto ASAP's website. So I'll go ahead and include a link in the chat in a couple of minutes that you can use to access that. Next slide. Perfect. So as mentioned, this is our 68th. So we've broadcast so far 67 webinars. We've had more than 14,000 attendees. We've just hit that mark. And we're really, really glad to be able to put these on for you. Next slide, please. We do a number of webinars in a variety of languages. So obviously English, and then we have French and Portuguese as well. You can actually go into our resource page and filter by language if you're looking for a specific one. Next slide. And the presentations are available as a PDF, and we also include a recording of the full webinar. So again, I'll go ahead and share that link in just a couple of moments. Next slide, please. And the best ideas that we have for our webinars come from you, because we want to put these on for you. They're all for you. So since this is a communications webinar, we would love if you could give us some more ideas for other communications or knowledge management webinars that you'd like to see in the future. We have some great ones coming up, but we're always interested in your ideas. So go ahead and put it in the chat, and I'll make sure to copy them down and we can get them planned for you. Next slide. And we have a couple of great upcoming webinars. So next week on the 16th, we're going to have procurement, logistics, and property management compliance issues. That's a mouthful, and it's also a very full webinar. Then on the 23rd, we have human resources, policies, and procedures. And we have an ASAP human resource consultant who will be presenting, along with 2 local partners who will be talking about their experiences in putting policies and procedures into place. And then on March 2nd, we're going to be doing a Telling Your Project Story communications webinar. And it's going to cover everything from social media, blog posts, success stories, and some really cost-effective and actionable strategies you can use to tell donors and your community more about your progress and success. And I'll be sure to share a link to the upcoming webinars in just a moment. Next, please. So now it is my great pleasure to introduce to you Molly Derrick. She is a Director of Integrated Communications at our wonderful consortium partner, PACT. And Molly has presented before on this subject, and she's even expanded this presentation now to be even more in depth. So we're really excited. She's going to be here to answer questions as well at the end of the webinar. So please feel free to use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and we'll go ahead and get those answered at the end. Welcome, Molly.
Thank you, Susan, and thank you everyone for joining. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everybody. It's wonderful to see where everyone is joining from. Next slide, please. Thank you again for joining today's webinar on developing a communication strategy. And thank you, Susan, for the introduction. As Susan said, my name is Molly Derrick, and I'm the Director of Integrated Communications at PACT. I'm excited to be with you all virtually today, and I look forward to getting to your questions later in the session. Next slide. In today's webinar, we're going to cover three main sections. The first is an overview of communication strategy, including why it's important for your organization and the main components of a strategy. Next, we'll talk about how to build that strategy, from who to include in the process to what you need to know to be successful in developing your strategy. We'll then turn to putting your newly developed communication strategy into action, how to know if what you're doing is working, and staying on top of changes both inside and outside of your organization that could impact your strategy. And as Susan said, we'll have plenty of time for questions, so please write down your questions as we go, or type them in the Q&A box that you see at the bottom of your screen. Next slide. We likely all have many things that we want different groups of people to know about our organizations, the work that we do, and lots more. You may have heard people say, my website says that we do this, so everyone should know about it. While that is a lovely thought, we know that that is not necessarily the case. It reminds me of this philosophical question: if a tree falls in a forest and no one is around to hear it, does it make a sound? So consider this: if your organization offers a really great service, but the people you want to use the service don't know about it, or know how to access it, or even where to find more information about it, then the service likely isn't going to have the impact that you would hope. Like the tree, people may have doubts about the service and its impact because they weren't there to see or experience it for themselves. A communication strategy could help with this challenge. It can help you reach your organizational goals by being proactive in your planning and outreach. Ensure that you have effective, consistent messaging being delivered by the best spokespeople. It can set you up for success so that you can focus on delivering excellent communications and messages that resonate with your audiences, and ensure that everyone at your organization is on the same page, delivering the same information and messages to the right audiences. It can also help you prioritize your efforts, especially when new opportunities arise that may or may not fit within your goals and objectives. Next slide. There are 5 key components of a communication strategy. We'll go over each of these in more depth in the coming slides, but I'll give you a little intro to each of them here. Your target audiences can vary depending on what you're trying to communicate, and they can shift over time. But in general, who are you trying to communicate with? Who needs to know about your organization and what you're doing? Messages get to who you are. What do you want to be known for? What do you need people to know about you or communicate to people? Channels are the methods for how you'll reach your target audiences with the messages that they need to hear. They can also vary depending on the audience and message and will likely change over time. For example, 10 years ago, maybe I should say 15 at this point, many of us likely did not imagine using Facebook or another social media platform to communicate directly with our audiences. Frequency refers to how often you need to or should communicate with your target audiences to ensure that they absorb your messages. And then measurement. Measurement is a critical component of any strategy, including a communication strategy. It's how you will know if what you're doing is working. What do you need to measure to understand if your strategy is working? So we'll dive into each of these in more detail in the next section on building your communication strategy. Next slide. Before you begin building your strategy, you should consider the overall goals of your organization. One of the benefits of a communication strategy is that it can help you reach your organizational goals. So being clear about what your organization is trying to accomplish is really important in building a communication strategy that will help you achieve those overall goals. Are you trying to change policy at the local or national level? If so, you'll want to build a strategy with messages that increase your audience's awareness of the issue and move them to act in support of policy change. And you'll want to build in measures of success, like the number of people who signed a petition, the number of government officials who supported the policy, or whether policy changes were actually made. To be successful, your communication strategy should always be tied to the goals and objectives of your organization. What do you need to say, how, where, and to whom to achieve those goals? It's also important to consider who should be a part of the strategy development process in the beginning. Communication staff are central to the development of the strategy, and they often lead the strategy development process. But there are many other people to consider, including the executive director or CEO of your organization, legal or compliance staff, business development staff, and technical experts. Each of these organizational stakeholders have unique perspectives and contributions to the development of a communication strategy. There may be others within your organization that you can think of and would like to include as well. Next slide. Your audiences are central to your communication strategy. You're likely going to get tired of hearing me say audiences. They're important when determining what messages to deliver and how to deliver those messages. We'll talk about audiences in almost every aspect of developing a communication strategy. And a really important first step in developing your strategy is mapping your audiences. Who do you need to communicate with? There will likely be several different audiences that you need to engage. These can include community members, donors, local government, partners, staff, and more. Within an audience, such as community members, there's a lot of further segmentation that could be done as well. Characteristics like age and gender can impact things like the channels that you use to deliver your message. When mapping your audiences, get as specific as you need to be successful and consider creating audience personas for each of your primary audiences. An audience persona is a profile of a group of similar people. Profiles usually include demographics, behaviors, goals, challenges, and interests, but they can be as detailed as you need them to be. To build an audience persona, just think about the average person within your target audience. Who are they? Are they active on social media? Do they tend to only engage via email? What are they most interested in? What are they motivated by? Those are some of the questions to consider. Once you've mapped your audiences, consider the specific actions that you want them to take. For example, you might want a community member to participate in a project activity or a government official to be informed about your work and how it supports a government policy. Understanding what action you want each group to take or your objective with each group will help when you begin to develop your messages. A final important consideration is whether you have the right people to deliver the messages to your audiences. Trust and credibility are really important parts of effective communications. You may be speaking to the right audience and using the right message, but if you don't have a level of trust with your audience or your messenger isn't seen as credible, then your communications are not going to be as effective. So consider whether there are people within your organization who fit this description. You may even have a partner or a local community leader who would be good messengers to consider. Next slide. So before we move on to talk about messaging, I wanted to show you an example of thinking through your goals with your different audiences and what action that you want them to take. You can have a goal that crosses multiple audiences. In this example, your organizational goal of increasing uptake of services might be relevant to all three of your audiences, and that's perfectly fine. Perhaps you need donors to fund your organization in order to increase that uptake, or you need government officials to change recommendations that might be limiting uptake. I kept this example simple to demonstrate how it could look, but it should be as simple or complex as you need it to be based on your goals. It's just a really helpful way to visualize how your goals and audiences are connected, and also connected to that action that you need them to take. Next slide. And this is a basic example of an audience persona. Again, these can be as detailed or simple as you need. This profile contains basic information about the audience. In this case, they are mostly male in their 50s to 70s who are university educated. They tend to favor more traditional ways of receiving information, such as through mainstream media and direct email. They're motivated by results and solving problems, and they're faced with challenges such as many priorities, requests, and also needs to justify the work that they support. Knowing this basic information can help you tailor your messages, the channels that you use, and the frequency of your communication to this audience, thereby increasing your likelihood of success. Another thing that people often do is name give the audience persona a name that fits the persona. And it's really helpful to have this to refer back to even after you've developed your strategy and you are in the implementation phase. Next slide. So now that you've mapped your audiences, you know what action you want each of them to take, and you've figured out who in your organization or network could be effective messengers. You need to look at what you need to communicate. What are those specific messages that you believe will move your audiences to act in the way that you want, from being more informed about a particular topic to visiting a health facility for care, for example. Here's where being clear about your organization's goals and purpose is really important. You typically start with a main message that cuts across your audiences. It's typically your why you exist as an organization, what you're trying to achieve, that overall purpose of your organization. From there, you may have specific messages for different audiences. It's often helpful to create a messaging tree or a messaging platform to organize your messages by audience. This structure moves from the highest level summary of your message to the most specific pieces of information and evidence that your audience will need to consider. The most important thing to remember is to be clear and concise in your messages. There's a saying that if you're explaining, you are losing. If it isn't apparent to your audience what your message means, it will not be effective and likely not result in anyone taking any of the actions that you had hoped for. In addition to being clear and concise, the number of messages for each audience is really important. In general, it is harder for people to remember more than 3 points at a time. Be clear in your ask of people to do something and help them understand why and explain how it benefits them. Next slide. So this is an example of a messaging platform. At the top, you'll start with your organization's mission and vision. These guide you in all your messaging and everything you do at the organization. This could also be the mission or the purpose of your project. Then you'd list your positioning statement. That's a high-level summary of who you are and what you offer. From there, you'll likely have key messages for different audiences that you're trying to reach. Again, remember, the simpler your messages are, the more they'll be repeated and remembered. And don't include too many messages since people can't usually remember more than 3. Finally, the next level down are proof points. What are those proof points that back up your messages? If you claim to have the largest footprint in a geography, what's your evidence to back that up? Or perhaps you offer services in 3 specific areas. The proof points would demonstrate or back up those messages that you're conveying. You can have one messaging platform for your organization or your project, or decide to create different versions for each of your target audiences. I've seen it done both ways. Ultimately, it's about what best fits your needs. For example, I know my team has multiple messaging platforms for our different audiences. Mission and vision cuts across all of them, and you'll see some overlap in them, but we do have separate ones for our different audiences. Next slide. So now that you know who you're talking to, you've developed clear and concise messages that will inspire people to act in a way that you want them to. You have to think about how you'll deliver the messages or which channels you'll use. As with developing your messages, you have to think about your audiences when deciding which channels to use. If your audience prefers TV, then you wouldn't want to prioritize radio in your strategy, or vice versa. Do your audience members have emails, or do they mostly communicate through Facebook or another social media platform? These are important to know so that you don't pick channels that are inaccessible to your audiences. This is also where your audience personas could really come in handy. Any good communication strategy should utilize multiple channels to deliver consistent messaging. This ensures that your message has a wider reach, and audiences are more likely to retain your message if they see it across multiple channels. If you remember the example from earlier, the audience persona example favored traditional media and email for receiving information. So you'd want to be sure to utilize both channels in your communication strategy. You should also consider what is already available to you. Many organizations have what are known as owned channels at their disposal. Things like your website, newsletter, publications, and your intranet are all owned channels that you can use to reach your various audiences. Then there are earned channels. Earned channels are those that cover your organization and work because it's important to their audiences, which hopefully overlap with yours. These can be local print, TV, and radio, as well as other media outlets. Media coverage is one of the most effective, inexpensive, and credible ways for nonprofit organizations to generate awareness about their organization in a crowded marketplace. While media engagement can provide benefits to the organization, it also comes with risks. Make sure that you recognize the benefits and risks of media engagement and consider how you'll balance those factors. If you haven't done a lot of media engagement before, start small by building relationships with one or two key journalists in your area who cover topics related to your work. Learn more about them and what they're working on, and offer your organization as a resource, as a way to get started with media engagement. Social is another popular channel that refers to social media like Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, and many other platforms. They can either be your own organization's social media accounts or those of others. There are many social media platforms out there today and more likely in development. Many people believe that social media is an easy channel to use. And many platforms certainly are easy to use, but to utilize social media in an effective way for your organization, you need to dedicate time and resources to it. You should think about each social media platform, its purpose, and whether it could serve your goals. For example, LinkedIn could be a great option for engaging with your staff or prospective staff, while Facebook may be better for reaching your program participants. If you have great visuals and imagery, you might want to consider Instagram. The most important thing to remember is where your audiences are. Finally, if you don't have any social media profiles right now and are considering start small with just one platform to get a sense of the time and effort that it takes to manage well. You'll want to be active and responsive to your audiences, no matter how many platforms you're on. Finally, there are paid channels. These include ads on social media, sponsored articles, and other promotional placements that you pay for. While some paid channels like sponsored articles can be quite costly, others like social media ads can be more cost effective. They can be very effective tools in your overall strategy. And speaking of paid channels, also important in determining your channels are the resources that you have available, both financial and human, at your organization. Running TV ads or programs may take more financial resources than you're able to dedicate to them. Maintaining multiple social media platforms takes a lot of time and dedicated effort to do really well, and you may not have the staff to run multiple accounts. So it's important to be realistic in planning to set yourself up for success in implementation. Next slide. Frequency, an important but often overlooked aspect of communications planning is the frequency or the cadence of communications that you have with your audiences. Having clear and concise messages is important, but adding consistent communications will further help your audience to retain your messages. The frequency may not be the same for all of your audiences or topics. You might need to communicate more frequently with certain groups, like your staff, and less frequently with others. And sometimes the frequency might be set for you, like with regular donor reporting or a set schedule for partner meetings. Other times, you'll need to consider how often an audience might need or want to hear from you. A content calendar is a really helpful tool for planning and ensuring regular communications with your audiences. As with everything else that we've talked about so far, consider your audiences and their needs. In the earlier audience persona example, one of the person's challenges was a high volume of requests coming from different places. You wouldn't want to add to their challenges by sending too many informational emails or emails without clear purposes. And don't be scared to ask how often someone wants to hear from you. I'm sure many of us have received an email like this from a newsletter that we're subscribed to. You may get one annually, and it says, how often would you like to hear from us? What would you like to hear from us? So don't be afraid to ask. Next slide. This is an example of a content calendar that can help you plan the frequency of your communications with your audiences. You can adjust the columns to whatever suits you best. For example, I find it helpful to have a column that shows who's leading on the content. If you have multiple people creating content in your organization or on your project, this might be helpful to add. In addition to helping you plan consistent communications, a content calendar can also help you see who you are and are not communicating with from your list of key audiences. You'll see in this example here that you have content planned for 3 different audiences. You may look at your calendar and see one of your audiences is missing. It's a way to easily recognize this and ensure that you're planning relevant communications for them. And if that low frequency was not intentional, we usually build these out monthly. So I would be able to quickly see a monthly snapshot and see who's missing, what topics are missing. So it could be a really helpful tool for communications. Next slide. Finally, we're going to talk about measurement. What you need to measure or what you measure should help you evaluate whether your strategy is effective and whether it needs to be adjusted. There are many different types of metrics that you can select to measure your communication strategy. You can measure your activities. These are often output measures, such as sending 1 newsletter per month or holding 2 events per quarter. You can also measure the reach of your communications. So how many people opened your newsletter or how many people visited your website last month. If you move a little further along that customer funnel beyond awareness, you can measure engagement. For social media, this could be the number of likes, comments, retweets, shares that your social media posts receive. For your website, it could be the number of downloads of a publication from your site or the number of newsletter signups. You can also measure impact. Did your communications influence a policy change? Did the audience change a particular behavior because of your communications? This is often more challenging to measure, and sometimes it relies more on qualitative data. While there are many different metrics that you can select, the most important thing to remember is to build metrics based on what you're trying to achieve with your communication strategy, and make sure you have metrics for each of your channels. As we move to the next section on implementing your strategy, your metrics will be really important for understanding how your strategy is working and whether you need to adjust or improve upon it. Next slide. Actually, you can go 2 forward. So putting your strategy into practice. Now that you've done all the work to build your communication strategy, it's time to put it to use. Timelines are essential for helping you stay on track when transitioning from the planning phase to implementation. Think about how often you want to review your plan. Regularly reviewing your metrics on a monthly or quarterly basis can help you stay on track. Other good times to review your performance include after major events, social media campaigns, or other specific activities. You should also regularly review your audiences. We've talked about how they can change over time. Have they changed? Have the dynamics within a specific audience changed over time? Are your audience personas still relevant? As we continue to experience changes in our world and access to information, you should also evaluate whether there are new channels at your disposal or whether your audiences are utilizing different channels today than when you started. Innovation is happening all the time, all around us, and new platforms and tools are constantly being developed. Perhaps there's a new social media platform or a new type of video experience that you want to evaluate. You don't always have to be on the latest social media platform or utilizing the newest technology. Just make sure that the channel is relevant to your audiences. If your audiences aren't on TikTok, you don't need to create a TikTok account. It's important to stay up to date with the methods of communication and how they may or may not support your goals and fit your audience needs and preferences. But don't feel compelled to act on the latest idea or the latest product. You may also find new tools and processes to communicate more efficiently and effectively as you implement your strategy. For example, as my team at PACT grew our social media engagement over the years, we realized that the free tool that we were using to manage our social media wasn't really working for us anymore. There were so many new options available to us that weren't there or that we weren't aware of when we started. We're now using a tool that better fits our needs and helps us work more efficiently and effectively. Just constantly looking at what's out there and how you can improve upon what you're doing. Being able to improve on your strategy will help you be a more successful communicator and achieve your organization's objectives. Next slide. Before we move on to the final section, I wanted to talk about crisis communications for a minute. Being prepared for a potential crisis has always been important in communications planning. However, these past 2 years have brought crisis communications into the forefront of every communicator's mind and likely many others at your organization as well. A crisis can be many different things. It can be a global pandemic that impacts the health and safety of your staff and the people your organization serves. We all know that really well. It can also be a negative story that appears in a local paper or an ethical issue that arises within your organization or in one of your projects. Not all issues or emergencies are crises, and not all crises need external action. A negative tweet about your organization from an account that has 10 followers likely will not warrant a response. An opinion piece in the largest local newspaper that uses incorrect facts about your organization or your work may warrant a direct response. It's important to be prepared for these potential crises. Know who within your organization should be alerted to the issue. Communications and legal staff are commonly involved, as well as your executive director or CEO. If it's a financial issue, you'll want to include your finance director or CFO. With a programmatic issue, you'd likely include your head of programs. Bringing the right people together to quickly assess the issue and determine the best course of action, which may sometimes be inaction, is an important step. In addition to thinking internally, you should also consider who needs to be notified outside of your organization. Does it impact your partners or donor? What about the people that your organization serves? In the case of the COVID-19 pandemic, everyone has been impacted. Our lives and work were upended. This is where having multiple channels to reach your audiences can be extremely beneficial. You may not have been able to utilize in-person channels like events and meetings. Many of us have been relying exclusively on digital channels in the beginning. Email, SMS, phone calls, all increased. When you're thinking about your channels, keep in mind disruptions to one or more of the channels and whether you have other means of reaching your audiences in an unexpected absence of one of your regular channels in a crisis. Next slide. Actually, you can go one more. So a thoughtful communication strategy that is aligned with your organization's goals will help you to meet your organization's objectives. Keeping your audiences in mind throughout the process, from developing messages that resonate with them to selecting channels that are accessible to them, your audiences really are central to your communication strategy. Map them and determine what action you want each audience to take. Keep your messages clear and concise, and don't overwhelm your audience with too many messages. Again, most people can only retain 3 messages at a time. Think about what channels are available to you and where your audiences already exist. Utilize multiple channels to deliver consistent messaging that reaches people in multiple ways. Plan a steady flow of communications for your audiences. You may not need to communicate with each audience at the same time or with the same frequency. Think about how often they need to hear from you and how often you need to communicate things. Finally, build metrics into your strategy based on what you're trying to achieve. Have metrics for each of your channels, and don't forget to review them regularly and adjust as needed. We don't want to collect data for data's sake, so make sure that you're utilizing it to improve upon your communications. Being proactive in your communications planning can make all the difference in being successful. It can sometimes be overwhelming to get started, but by focusing on the key components that we talked about, you can set yourself up and your organization up for success. And oftentimes, the process of developing a strategy leads to really important conversations and key learnings for everyone involved. Next slide. So thank you for joining me today and for your attention throughout the presentation. I really appreciate you spending your valuable time with us today. I'll take questions now. Again, if you have a question that you'd like to ask and haven't shared it yet, please type it into the Q&A box on your screen.
Perfect. And I'm going to go ahead and launch our webinar survey as well right now, so people can go ahead and start filling that out. So we have a number of questions, really great questions. First one is, at what point in a project or the development of an organization should a communication strategy be developed?
Really great question. And often it doesn't quite happen as soon as I would recommend. I would put the communication strategy at the front of the process. A lot of times communications comes, unfortunately, as an afterthought because you're so focused on the work that needs to be done, the activities of a project, and fulfilling a lot of the requirements that you have. And then communications kind of comes as a bit of an afterthought. But communications can really help set your project up for success. So when you're planning for your project, from the very beginning, before it has really started activities, that's when I would start developing your communications plan, so that you have a plan in place when your project begins. Same thing with an organization. We actually just went through a strategy development process at my organization to develop a new organizational strategy for the coming 3 years. And we worked on a communication strategy in tandem. It did come a little bit later because you obviously need to know more about the goals and the objectives of your organization. And then your communication strategy helps to support those goals and objectives. But we also had that in place before we began implementing the new strategy.
Excellent, thank you. So we have a couple questions about social media. And one of them is about some of the contracts and cooperative agreements don't allow for the organization or project to promote the project online, like through social media. So the question is what to do in that case, how best to kind of communicate about your project when you can't individually report about it on social media.
Yeah, that's a really great question. And there are often limitations to what channels you can use. I would go back to your audiences and think about where else they are. Are they, do you have other options available to you to reach your target audiences? I also think a lot of people default to social media. They think they have to have a social media presence. But at the end of the day, it comes down to who are you trying to reach? Are those people on social media? Would they rather be getting updates via email or a WhatsApp group, or maybe they're avid readers of the local newspaper? Think about those other channels and ways that you can put your communications out there, your messages out there, and reach your audiences if you don't have social media available to you. I don't know the specifics of this, so you would have to check to make sure that this is okay. But if you can't have if you can't run, if you can't manage a social media channel, that doesn't mean that other people can't talk about you, or doesn't necessarily mean that other people can't talk about you on social media. So maybe you won't have a project social media handle, but a lot of people, you may have noticed on social media, if somebody isn't on social media, that doesn't prevent other people from talking about them on social media. They just hashtag their name. So a lot of times you can go on social media and still find information about about an organization or project or person, and they aren't even on the platform. So there are other options there, but that's a really good question.
Excellent. And another sort of thing to add there is that you can also talk to your AOR, your COR about submitting social media posts to them for USAID, for example, to be able to share on your behalf. So of course they want to tell about your great success and your project and your progress. So you can certainly discuss submitting some of that through them as well. That might be an option.
Yeah, that's another great one, Susan.
Perfect. So we're getting a ton of great questions. So one of them is, I think, a really important question about the difference between a communication strategy and a marketing strategy.
Yeah, that's a good question. So I think a little bit more about a marketing strategy in terms of you're trying to sell something. A lot more goes into a marketing strategy where you're doing you're doing market research and seeing, okay, you have this product that you're trying to get out, and these other groups also have a similar product. What could be your market share? And there's a lot more that goes into a marketing strategy, but it's more focused on you are trying to sell a product or a service. And with a communication strategy, it's more general, more focused on creating awareness and spurring action that is not necessarily tied to the sale of something. Does that Susan, feel free to add to that if you have anything else that you'd like to add.
No, that's perfect. Yeah, I think the sell versus tell is sort of the main thing. All right, so we have another few questions specific to social media and websites. One of the questions is, how can we generate traffic to our websites and social media platforms?
Great question. I know that we've had many conversations about this in my organization, PACT, within my team. I would use both platforms to promote the other. So in your social media, always including a link to back to something on your website. You really want to drive traffic there. So when you're sending out, say you have a newsletter that you're sending out, or you're promoting a new wonderful publication that you have, directing people to your website is really important through those other channels that you have. You can also, from your website, embed your social media into your website. So you can do this with a feed on your somewhere on your website of your social media. You can also do this within certain articles, like if you have a blog and you want to embed just one tweet or one Facebook post within it, so that people can easily click on it and get to your social media post or page and join the conversation. You can also, again, through your other channels like newsletters, if you're at an event, and making sure that all of your materials have your website listed on them, and that it's easy for people to access, and again constantly be reminded of your website and your social media. That's another really really great way to drive traffic. You can also have other people drive traffic to your website and your social media. Your partners, asking your partners to tag you in posts that are related to the project that you're working on together. That's a really great way, because then their audiences see your social media handle and their post, and may visit your social media channels through that. Also, jointly working on communications together and posting it on both of your websites and driving traffic to one another, that could be another option. So there are a number of things that you can do to excuse me, to drive traffic.
Wonderful. Thank you, Molly. So we have some questions. As you know, communications now is so heavily dependent on metrics. That's one of the things that we need to output to show why communications is so important. So a number of the questions are related to that. What type of free tools can we use for tracking traffic to the website? As well as somebody would like to know an example of a matrix we've used to measure communication. So any other tools and things we could share?
Yep. Metrics are always a really a topic that people really want to talk about. Again, it really depends on the goals of your communications. But for websites specifically, you can use Google Analytics. You should be able to have set up a free Google Analytics account for your website to review some basic metrics like traffic, and to better understand what pages people are visiting, how long they're staying on your site, how many pages they might be visiting in one session. Those are all really, really good metrics to look at for your website. Also, if you have any conversion opportunities on your website, like a newsletter sign up, or if you have a publication that you have available, a resource that you think a lot of people would like, if you attach an email sign up to the download, that's another conversion opportunity. So you can look at those as well. Also just look at the number of downloads that are happening from your site. So not only are people visiting, what are they doing while they're on the site, and are they accessing your materials through downloads? For social media, again, I think it depends on where you are in the social media journey, but all of the social media platforms have built-in analytics. So some of them are better than others, and they are continuously evolving. I think Instagram analytics are much better than they were a few years ago. So you can get these free analytics through the different platforms. And depending on where you are in your social media journey, say you just started an account, maybe what you want to do in the beginning is just focus on building that audience, getting people to follow you, and seeing what the reach of your social media posts are. Once you've kind of established yourself, then maybe you want to start looking at engagement with your social media posts. So not just how many people saw your message, but how many people interacted with it. Did they like it? Did they comment on it? Did they share it? That's another really important measure for social media analytics. So those are just a couple. I think also for newsletters, if you use a newsletter, there are a lot of newsletter platform service providers out there. We use MailerLite, but we have used MailChimp. They have free versions of those, so it depends on how many people are in your newsletter list. So if you are able to use the free version, you get analytics through that to see how many people opened your email, how many people clicked on a link that you provided. Again, a link that could be directing them to your website. So it is great that a lot of these tools that we use come with basic analytics. They may not offer everything that you would like, but they're certainly a really good way to get started with analytics.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. We had a question about the difference between a communications strategy and a communications policy.
That's a great question. So a communications policy, I think, would govern more of what is allowed or acceptable within your organization or project. I think of something like that's related to communications, but a policy, something like a brand policy, where that states what your what your brand is, and there are different types of branding that you could take. This is more for organizational, not for project, because I know that is tied to branding and marketing rules and regulations. But from an organizational perspective, you may decide that you want to be what is called a branded house. And that means that you may have lots of teams and programs and projects, but you all use with, of course, outside of projects that are required to follow other branding and marketing guidelines, you all follow one brand. Then you may decide that you wanted to be a house of brands. I think of somebody like Procter and Gamble in this example. They have many brands that they own, and they all have separate logos and names, and they are individual brands within the Procter and Gamble brand. So they're not easily recognizable as belonging to one organization, one company. And that would be something that you would lay out in a policy. You may also lay out in a policy things around ethical communications, things that you do and do not do as an organization. So it may cover things like you do not use images or quotes from people who have not given permission. It may include things like we follow a principle of do no harm, and we do not put out stories or communications that may that may put the people in the story in any kind of additional risk. So there may be things that you would cover in a communications policy that might be different from what goes in the communications strategy and plan.
Thank you, Molly. We have a great question that's probably a little bit of a longer answer, but at what point should communications be considered into the budget? So I know we talked a little bit about, we'd like to get this very early on, obviously, in a project's conception, but ideally, where is it being added into the budget for a project?
Yeah, really great question, and something again that I think people should be thinking about from the start of project budgeting. One of the things that I suggest to people is that if your project contains communications activities where you know you are going to need communication support, if you're going to be developing a lot of materials, if you're going to be hosting, planning a lot of events, that type of thing, you should be building communications time and activities into the project budget from the beginning, because oftentimes what you'll see is you plan, some of those things don't get planned for in the budget in the beginning, and they end up being a little bit more costly than I think people imagine. Mostly the time that it takes to do communications than some of the specific activities. So I think it really depends on your project and how your organization is set up. You may have communications staff at your organization that work for the organization and support all of the projects within the organization. You may not have communication staff and you're looking at this new project and you're going to submit a proposal for it, and it has a need for communication. So building that into the project budget from the start is what I would recommend, because oftentimes it is harder to come in at the later once budgets have been approved and implementation has started, to add that back in or find ways to do that later.
Excellent, thank you. We have some questions about what types of communication channels best reach an audience. And of course, this will depend very much on who the audience is, but do you have a couple of tips there?
Yes, so a really easy one. It does very much depend on your audience and what they have available to them. But for I'm going to start with staff, because that's a pretty easy one. Typically, for your own internal staff, the best way to reach them is in-person meetings, which I know can be challenging right now with COVID for many of us. So email or virtual meetings. If your organization has an intranet, that as well. So those are pretty standard for that audience. Then you have donors. Again, it really depends on who your donor is and who the individual is that you engage with, because that's another thing. You could have an audience persona that provides information about the average person, but if you know specifically, like, I'm communicating with 2 people, and then exactly whether they fit an audience persona, and exactly how they communicate. So So go with that. So you typically email is a really good way to communicate with donors. And we don't find or we haven't found that they are, while yes, like Susan said earlier, the US government, USAID, others, there are lots of different handles on social media that they operate, but and those are good for engaging with, but a lot of times the best way to reach them is directly having something delivered to their inbox or inviting them to an event. For community members, it really depends, and I think that one is the most wide ranging. We have communities and where we're working on projects, and they're so active on WhatsApp. That's what they want to use to communicate. We have others where Facebook is the internet, and they do everything through Facebook, and so we're communicating with them through specific Facebook groups that were organized by the project. Then you have other places where it really is community meetings and more of the face-to-face interaction. So I always encourage you. I don't think there are a lot of there's much like just general guidance to give on these are the channels for these different audiences. Staff really is the easiest one, but from there, you really do have to consider who you're talking to and where they are, how they like to communicate. But I think you will see as you go that maybe you within your project or your organization can start to see those emerge, how best to reach certain audiences, even across projects within your organization.
Thank you, Molly. We have a really good question, which I think everybody is sort of dealing with. How do you develop a communication strategy when you're really dealing with a changing organization? Certainly, we're all sort of dealing with that right now because of COVID and all the changes that created. But what are some of the considerations there?
Yeah, that is a really great question, and definitely something we've all been dealing with. I think that's where for a place where you have a communication strategy that maybe already exists, and then your organization is going through a lot of change. It could be that your organization is changing its goals and what it's trying to achieve. I think being a part of that conversation about your organization's overall purpose is really important, because it can then help you to ensure that you're able to update that communication strategy to support that organizational strategy. And then there are also times, like Susan just mentioned, we've all been going through a lot of change, and we may not have access to the channels that we used to. Our audiences maybe have changed in that time. And looking back at your communication strategy and reassessing what is no longer maybe working for you. We used to have regular in-person staff meetings, and of course we're not doing that anymore. We used to put up signs in our offices about important things. Well, nobody's going into our office anymore, so they're not seeing those messages that way. We used to have a thing called Pack TV. We had TVs around a couple of screens in our offices, and we would broadcast messages through that. Those channels were not available to us after the COVID-19 pandemic began, and we all started telecommuting. So helping the organization, I think it's really important for communications to be a part of those conversations with your organizational leadership, to talk about how you adapt and adjust in these types of cases. If you don't have a communication strategy and your organization is in flux, I think it depends on what type of flux that is. If it's what we just talked about, where you have channels that you don't have available to you anymore, then I think that's a little bit easier to adjust, because you're now just exploring other ways to reach your audiences that they are have access to, and that you also have access to. If the flux is more we've gotten new leadership and they're going to change things, but we really don't know how they're going to change yet. That's one of those cases where I think it's more difficult to develop an organizational communication strategy. This is likely not the case for a project communication strategy, but an organizational one. If you aren't sure of the direction that your organization is headed, in the example that I gave earlier, where my organization just went through a new strategy development process, we had a lot of people who were asking us, well, what should our messaging be right now? How should we be talking to people? Are we talking to different people? And our guidance to staff was, we're still operating under until a new strategy is finalized, we're still operating under the old one. Strategy development processes for organizational strategies can take 6-9 months for them to be developed. So there's a little bit of anxiety that happens during that process for, well, we know things are changing, so we should be saying something different. But until you really know how things are changing, you keep saying what you've been saying before until you know what that new future looks like. I hope that helped a little bit.
Thanks, Molly. That was great. We have a couple of questions about where the strategic plan versus the project plan, where the communications policy, or pardon me, strategy fits in. And do they work together? Are they separate strategies? How does that work?
I've mostly seen them as separate, but they work together. If you think about translating from the organizational level to the project level, you may have an organizational strategy and then an organizational communications plan that supports that strategy. Same thing with a project. You have a project plan, you know the goals and the objectives of your project and what you're trying to accomplish. And oftentimes you have a communication strategy that is developed to support that overall project strategy. It should be tied to the project strategy. It doesn't need to be the same document, but it should be related, and it should tie back to the overall goals and objectives of the project. And oftentimes the project will also lay out key audiences. So you can use that as a way to start on your audience development for projects.
Excellent, thank you. And as a bit of a spin-off from that, we have a couple questions about, does each project under an organization need its own communications plan?
No, I do not. I don't think they do. But often, so most projects, or all projects funded by the U.S. government, or USAID, will have branding and marketing plans, but they don't necessarily have full communications strategies. I have seen projects that have full strategies, and then I've seen projects that have that kind of build from that branding and marketing plan, and expand it somewhat into something that looks a little bit like a hybrid between that branding and marketing plan and a communications plan. But they do not have to all have communication strategies. I also think it really depends on the type of project that you're implementing. Sometimes there are projects where you are doing a limited activity. You have one audience that you're engaging with, and it doesn't require the development of a full communications strategy. So I think it really depends on that, the project, and the purpose, and the goals and objectives for the project. But it doesn't have to have, they don't all have to have communication strategies. I would argue that they are helpful to have, even if they are that kind of basic, like, build off of the branding and marketing plan.
Perfect. And we had a question about the difference between a communication strategy and an advocacy strategy. Is it necessary to have both at an organization?
Yeah, I think if you are an advocacy organization, if you engage in a lot of advocacy, it is helpful to have a separate advocacy strategy. Some of the examples that I used in the presentation were actually related to policy change. And many people are actually you're working on local policies, policy change, education and awareness, but you're not necessarily doing full advocacy, where it is more education and awareness, which of certain audiences, which would fit more into a communications strategy. If you are an advocacy organization, though, or if that is one of the main functions of your organization, building an advocacy strategy separate from the communication strategy, but again, making sure that they're not in conflict with one another, would be really important. There you would be looking at things like influencers who could influence, say, the government officials that you needed to vote on a particular piece of legislation. Or you might be looking at activating the general public around certain topics, and you use different tools for advocacy than communications. There's some great advocacy specific tools out there. So I think that you would want to have something that is different if you are engaging in that level of advocacy. But if you are, again, really trying to educate and make people aware about the need for guidelines or policies at the national or local level on a particular topic, you can do that through a regular communication strategy.
Excellent, thank you. And just we'll do quickly 2 more questions. We're almost out of time. Could you explain a little bit more about earned channels and how those work for nonprofits?
Yeah. You know, the earned channels really, it's where people want to share your information because they think it's relevant to their audiences. Media typically falls into this category. So think about your local media outlet. If you are and what's important to their constituents who reads their newspaper, your project likely has things that are of interest to them. So reaching out and developing a relationship with a local outlet, or sharing press releases with them that you put together, inviting local media to an event that you're hosting, could be a really good way to garner coverage for your issue or your project. And then that outlet publishes articles. They may come to you if you have topical experts. You can offer your staff to them if the journalists say they're really focused on climate change right now, and they really want to talk about climate change, or they really want to talk about the impacts of climate change on health, on individuals' health. If you have experts in that area in your organization, you may not have a relevant project or story to share, but reaching out and understanding what their priorities are and saying, oh, well, we have an expert on that topic on our staff. If you'd ever like to speak with them about the issue, or if you're looking for background information on a topic, please reach out to us. Starting that relationship with them, and then it could lead to coverage for your project or your issue that you're focused on. That would be media is most typically the earned channel that people think about the most. And like I said, it's a really great opportunity, but it does come with risks, because you can't control what is then written, and there are things that if somebody gets something wrong, you can go back and ask them to correct, but it does come with risks. So it should be something that you just consider before you begin engaging. And I know a lot of times in USAID funded projects, you also have to talk with your relevant contact about engaging with the media, and sometimes making sure that you're getting things signed off on before you do that type of engagement.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Molly. We've run out of time, and you answered a ton of questions. I know everyone's very appreciative. We certainly are. And we just want to go ahead and thank you very much for coming today and presenting. And thank you, of course, to USAID and PEPFAR for putting on these webinars and allowing us to do so. Just a reminder that we have several upcoming webinars. I'm going to go ahead and add the link one more time into the chat so that you'll have it. And we do have another communications webinar coming up very soon, March 2nd. It's going to be telling your project story. It's going to touch on much of what Molly was talking about today. We'll go a little bit more in depth into how to use social media and blogs, your website, for your project or for your organization. And thank you again so much, Molly. Any last words from you?
Just thank you, everybody, for the wonderful questions. Thank you, Susan, for having me, and to the ASAP team for putting these webinars together. I was really happy to participate, and thank you to everybody who joined.
Perfect. Thanks so much, everyone. And we're going to go ahead and share the link to upcoming webinars now in the chat. Oh, it did not quite want to attach there. Well, we'll have the newsletter going out on Monday as well, and you'll get updates there. Thank you, everyone. And we're going to go ahead and close now.